which means that most of the gospel readings for Sunday will be taken from Luke's gospel. So might hopefully give you a sense of what Luke is all about and get into the Lucan mindset. And the way I'm looking at it is, it's a meeting Jesus in Luke's gospel. There's a picture of a meeting. You probably know who the man in question is, the fellow up the tree. Zacchaeus. And Luke is the only one who tells us about Zacchaeus, you know. And what I'm going to do is just focus on the person of Jesus, and I'll say why. And tonight I'm just going to do some introductory stuff, basically about, well, what are Gospels all about anyway, and then something about Luke, the specific Gospel of Luke. And then hopefully we'll move on to discussing together a passage that I give out to you, and you can talk about it, more about that later. Next night, what I hope to do is to ask the question, well, who is God for the Jesus of Luke's Gospel? Like, when we read the story of Luke, Jesus talks about God a lot. How does Jesus in Luke's Gospel see God? Then we'll focus on, the third night, we'll focus on something that's very central to Luke's Gospel, and that is Jesus, the friend of the poor, the outcast, and the sinner, which I think is very relevant for our ministry today. Then we'll move on then on the fourth night to talk about something again which is central in Luke's Gospel, Jesus as a Saviour. And we'll try and explore a little bit with the help of Luke, like what salvation is all about, you know. Because both we're all into if you're in ministry at all, you're into the business of helping people, you know, to experience salvation. And then finally, the last night, we look on Jesus the prophet. Again, I think something that is important for our ministry. So that's basically what I hope to cover. Now, the heart of our Christian faith, the heart of our Christian mission, or spirituality, is not an ideology. It's not a philosophy. It's not a social program. It's not a collection of beliefs. It's not a system of laws or an ethical code. The heart of our Christian faith is a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And when I talk about Jesus Christ, we're not talking about Jesus as somebody who was a figure of the past, a historical person, a person who lived and died. But by reason of his resurrection, Jesus is alive, is present, and active in our world today. Remember in St. John's Gospel, Jesus, before he died, said to his disciples, like, you're all very sorry that I'm going away. But my going away is going to mean coming back to you in a new way, making possible a new relationship with me. A relationship that's even deeper, more intimate, and more powerful than the relationship they had with him when they walked with him on the roads of Galilee. Pope Francis is somebody who emphasizes very much that the heart of our Christian faith, spirituality, mission, ministry is a person, Jesus Christ. Just to give you quickly a flavour of what he says. In Evangelii Gaudium, which is his first great document on the life and ministry of the church, the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus, all who meet Jesus. I wish to encourage the Christian faithful to embark on a new chapter of evangelization marked by this joy. When his most recent document, Gaudete et Exhortate, the one on holiness, we're all into the business of holiness, he says that mission has its fullest meaning in Christ and can only be understood through him. At its core, holiness is experiencing in union with Christ the mysteries of his life. So holiness basically is uniting ourselves with the mysteries of Jesus Christ, particularly his death and resurrection, but also the events of his earthly life. And even that great document, Laudato Si, on the environment, care for our common home, the earth, he talks about the risen Jesus permeating the whole created world. The creatures of this world no longer appear to us under merely natural guise, because the risen one is mysteriously holding them to himself and directing them towards the fullness as their end. The very flowers of the field and the birds which his human eyes contemplated and admired, or to be admired, are now imbued with his radiant presence. So even in creation, like the risen Christ is present. You get poets like the Irish poet Plunkett. I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars the glory of his eyes. His body gleams amid eternal snows. His tears fall from the skies. Lastly, just a little quote. When the Pope was speaking to members of the PBC, that's the Pontifical Biblical Commission. That is a collection of foremost biblical scholars in the Catholic world who come together in Rome from time to time to talk about the Bible. And the Pope said to them, our faith does not have at its centre only a book, but a story of salvation surrounding a person, Jesus Christ, the Word of God made flesh. That's what he said to people who spend all their lives studying the Bible, the book. He says, remember, it's not an end in itself. It's only to introduce us to a person. So the basic question is, who is Jesus for me? Where and when do we meet Jesus? How do we meet Jesus Christ? Now, the risen Jesus Christ is present everywhere and at all times. And the risen Jesus can make himself known to us in various ways. In the people we meet, in the experiences, in the events of life, and in the created world. But what I want to emphasize here in our meetings here is that the reading of the Gospels can be one of the principal ways that makes us more sensitive to the presence of Jesus Christ in the world today. Reading a Gospel is not just about, finding out about a person of the past, but a Gospel introduces us to Jesus Christ today. A Gospel facilitates a meeting with Jesus Christ today. A Gospel helps us to deepen our relationship with Jesus Christ today. So let's look briefly at the purpose of a Gospel. What's a Gospel all about? Now, the main purpose of a Gospel is not to give us information. Sometimes we read a Gospel because we want to find out how it happened back there. But no evangelist wrote to give us information, just information for information's sake, to tell us exactly what happened in the life of Jesus Christ, to give us exact detail. If that's what you're looking for in a Gospel, at times the Gospels will disappoint you. Every evangelist was more interested in transformation, not information, but the transformation of our own lives in the present through meeting Jesus Christ. Every evangelist wrote from a perspective of faith and wrote at a time, when Jesus had risen from the dead, decades previously. So wrote in the light of resurrection faith, of the fuller understanding that came after the resurrection, when Jesus gave his Spirit to the disciples to help them understand who he was and what he is all about. So the evangelists are writing out of that fuller understanding, that faith understanding, and also the right to draw forth faith from us. They're not just saying, here, take it or leave it. You might like to read this and leave. No. they are really trying to get us to make a faith response to Jesus Christ. And thirdly, every evangelist writes with an eye to the present situation in which he lived. And writes, he wants to retell the story of Jesus in a way that's relevant for his own day. And that answers the questions of his own communities. And when we read the Gospel, we have to read them in that spirit, asking ourselves, well, what is relevant here for our day? And how is it helping us to answer the questions that we have today? So we read the Gospels in faith. We read the Gospel open to be changed and transformed. And we also read the Gospels hoping to get meaning for today. Since the beginning of the last century, in the early 1900s, the main focus went on what the Gospels meant in the past. What the Gospels meant, or what we find in the Gospel, like what did it mean at the time of Jesus, when Jesus walked around Galilee? And then they said, well, now the tradition about Jesus was carried on, was preserved in the early Christian communities. So what was going on there? What did it mean there? And then different evangelists came along, and they actually wrote their own Gospels and selected traditions about Jesus. Why did they do that? What did it mean for them? So the whole thing is on meaning in the past. And that's why they say the Gospels were seen like a window through which you looked at the world in the past and got information about it. But now the Gospels, the emphasis is going on what the Gospels mean today, what they mean for us today. And people say they're not just windows. A Gospel is a mirror. When you look in a mirror, what do you see? You see yourself. Huh? You see, the Gospels then reflect something. A mirror reflects something to you. It reflects the ups and downs of your own faith journey. It reflects possibilities for human living, dimensions of human life, particularly the faith dimension. It reflects who we are as disciples of Jesus Christ and who we are called to be as disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, the Gospel as story, that's something that's been emphasized quite a bit today also. How will I put this? That every evangelist wrote a story. Every evangelist constructed a story world, a narrative world, which has characters who relate to one another, which has events which are interrelated, which has its own time, its own pace, which has its own unfolding plot, which has its own point of view, its own value system. So an evangelist has constructed a world, and we are being invited into that world. Whether we realize it or not, we are being invited to identify with characters in that world, particularly the characters who espouse the values that are being promoted by that world, and to distance ourselves from the characters that do not accept the values that are being promoted. Just think about what happens when you read a good book or go and see a good movie. People talk about getting lost in the book or getting lost in the movie, because almost in a sense you have suspended your existence in the actual world and gone into a new world. Have you ever noticed that in movies sometimes if you have a really good movie, people are slow to leave. They're sitting the seats. They're going through the process of disengaging from the world. So, reading a good story, seeing a good movie, we are being influenced. We are being challenged. Questions are being posed for us. And when we read a good book and see a good movie or a good play, a drama, then we get different perspectives on our own world, and we start to ask questions about our own world. And that's what's happening in the dynamics of reading a story. Do you get the point? And a lot of emphasis now in the last 30 years or so with scripture people, it's called narrative criticism. They look on the Gospels as stories and not just as historical accounts of the past. Stories which influence us today. Another point to keep in mind, we never read a Gospel in a purely objective way. Now, we never come to a Gospel with a clean slate mind. We come with our own questions. We come with our own understanding. We come with our own perspectives. We come from a particular social status. We come with our own prejudices. So we don't come with a blank mind, but our tradition, our cultural, our religious tradition influences what we see in the text. And we come with questions, and we ask questions of the Gospels. But remember, the Gospel is also asking questions about you. The Gospel is also putting a question to you. We come to interpret the text, but the Gospel is also interpreting you. We come looking for meaning in the text, but the Gospel is also looking for meaning in your life. So that's what happens. And it's important to remember that in any Gospel passage, or in any Gospel as a whole, there's no such thing as one right answer which excludes all other answers. Because people come at it from different perspectives and see different things in it. And it's very good in reading a Gospel to listen to how other people interpret the text, particularly people who are different, whose opinions are a little bit different from your own. We can learn a lot from listening. Interpretation, reading the Gospel, getting meaning out of a Gospel is not just a private thing, but we do it together as a community. It's a joint exercise. Women will see stuff in the Gospels that men will never see. And there's a whole area of biblical study called feminist study. And they come up with insights, and some of them tremendous insights. People in a place like South America, reading the Gospel in a poor community, in a basic Christian community, they will see something in the Gospel that the academic sitting at his desk in Europe or America will never see. Why? Because of where they're coming from. So it's very important that we keep that in mind. And I think it gives all of us confidence. Like, we all come with our own questions, our own personal history, our family history, our own baggage, but that kind of can be a help to exploring the meaning of the Gospel and sharing it with one another. So this thing here, this just summarizes what I have been saying, that there are different approaches to a Gospel. One approach, and it was the dominant approach in the last century. When I studied in Rome, did biblical studies, it was the only approach we had, and that was the historical approach, the world behind the text. We were told, when you read the Gospel, keep in mind what's happening, what happened at the stage of Jesus, and then what happened in the communities that preserved the stories about him, and then what was happening to the evangelists at the time of the evangelists. So the focus was on the world behind the text. Now, what I've been talking about, the world of the text, that story world of the text, like, into which we are invited. Some people will read the Gospels now and write books on it from that point of view, emphasizing very much that they're stories into which we're invited, and you shouldn't get too much distracted about historical questions. And then you have other people that read the Gospel with the main focus on the world today and the questions we bring. And that's sometimes called a contextual reading of the Gospels, the context today in which we find ourselves. We read the Gospel from that standpoint. So I would ask you to read the Gospel of Luke over the next few weeks for the duration of this course and get a sense of that story. And ask yourself, well, what's striking me in reading this story? And as much yourselves, like when you come together, maybe we can share informally over a cup of tea or in groups, like what is striking us. The version, there are different versions of the Gospels. The one I use is the New Revised Standard Version. But there are others, like the New Jerusalem Bible. I think Eddie has one there. The New American Bible. But all of the Gospels were written in Greek. So if you know Greek, read it in Greek. But every translation of the original language is an interpretation. So sometimes you get the different versions translating a verse or a passage in a different way. And that can give us insights as well. It's just something about that's just something I picked up from a man called Brendan Byrne, who wrote a book on Luke called The Hospitality of God. The Jesus portrayed in the Gospels is the risen Lord, active in the community today. The whole aim of the narrative is to engage the reader in the drama in such a way as to effectively communicate the sense of being a participant, not a spectator, in what is going on. I am Peter, overcome with confusion in the boat. I am the widow whose son was raised. I am the woman who touched the fringe of his cloak. I am the leper who returned to say thanks. This is not make-believe. Behind it lies the reality for the believer that Jesus is really alive, and that those His Spirit touches undergo an experience of salvation that is just as immediate and real for them as it was for those who saw Him, heard Him, and felt His touch in Galilee and Judea. So the Gospel may appear to be a story about back there, but it is not really about back there at all. We would not read the Gospel of Luke at all if we did not recognize that it in some way, that it is in some sense our story too. The hopes and longings for liberation voiced by the characters in the Gospel remain our hopes today. Like them, we stand between promise and fulfillment. That's it's a good quotation to summarize what I was saying about, its meaning for us today and the risen, getting us in touch with the risen Lord today. How many of you have seen that before? Some of you have, huh? Yeah, it's quite a common thing. Where? How many of you have seen that before? Some of you have, huh? Yeah, it's quite a common thing. Where we stand influences how we interpret. Again, what I was saying, what we bring to the text. Now, the idea is you have 6 blind men. Now, these weren't blind men all the time. They did see at a particular time, and they have in their memory bank, in their imagination bank, they know what certain things are. But then they all became blind. And one thing they never saw was an elephant. Never saw an elephant. So they're all brought to the elephant, And they're asked, well, what is it? And this fella here, the tusk, he says, it's the spear. This one here, he has the nose of the elephant. It's a snake. This fella here has the ear of the elephant in his hand. It's a fan. The man, the bulk of the elephant. It's a wall. The other one, the leg. It's a tree trunk. And a fella at the back holding the tail. It's a rope. Now the idea is that's a kind of a pictorial presentation of what I've been saying. Where you stand influences what you see. Like the fellow here, like he kind of comes to the conclusion that a certain thing from being here, the guy there comes to a different conclusion. And what they have in their memory bank and in their imagination determines. This man here obviously had seen a spear, and now he feels something and it's like a spear. You get the idea? Okay, any questions now? Because I want to go on to talk about a little bit about Luke. I've talked about the gospel in general, but before we go on and talk about Luke specifically, are there any questions? How are we done for time? Let me see.
We're right.
Okay.
Right, yes.
And remember, the best question is often the stupid one. Anyway, let's continue a little bit with Luke. Luke was a well-educated Gentile Christian from Antioch in Syria. Antioch was the third most important city in the Roman Empire at the time Luke wrote, and that was in the mid-80s, about some 50 years after Jesus died and rose. Antioch was a very cosmopolitan place. You had people from many different cultures living in Antioch. So Luke knew quite a bit about I suppose cross-cultural living. Antioch also was the great missionary centre, Christian missionary centre. We find out that from the Acts of the Apostles. So Luke faced the challenge of cross-cultural Christian mission. As I say, he was a well-educated Gentile, probably a Gentile. Some people say, no, he wasn't a Gentile, he was a Jew because he knows the Old Testament so well. But probably, when you read the Acts of the Apostles, you see that there's a class of people, Gentiles, who hang around the synagogue. They're interested in Judaism, but they don't want to become Jews. So they get to know the Jewish scriptures, etc. Luke was probably one of those. And he's well educated, his Greek and everything like that is very, very good. Now, he was also a companion of Paul. Most would say that. Colossians, the letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verses 14, talks about Luke, the beloved physician. I should have said that. There is a tradition that he was a doctor, a physician. Many of our hospitals are called St. Luke's hospitals. And that comes from that verse in Colossians. Certainly Paul is a great hero of Luke. And in the Acts of the Apostles, when you're reading the Acts of the Apostles, you come across certain passages where Luke speaks in the first person plural when he's talking about what Paul is doing. We did this. We did that. We went here. We went there. So he's talking about somebody who is actually involved in the story. So that's one of the main reasons why we see him as a companion of Paul. Some would say he wasn't because his theology is quite different from Paul, but I think most would say that at least for some time he was a close companion of Paul and went around with Paul. Now, why did Luke write? Well, he gives the answer himself in the opening passage of his Gospel. The other evangelists don't do this, but Luke tells us why he actually wrote. He says, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." So Luke tells us that he depended on the work of people before him. And it's universally accepted that Luke knew Mark's Gospel and knew and took over a lot of material from Mark's Gospel. 65% of Mark's Gospel you'll find it in Luke. He also used a source, a collection of Jesus' sayings, which Matthew also used. So he said he investigated what went before him, what the people whom he called eyewitnesses and servants of the Word did. And notice what he doesn't just say they were eyewitnesses, there were people who made a record. No, they were servants of the Word. They looked at what happened. They interpreted what happened. They saw the meaning of what happened. They saw it as an expression of the Word of God. And in writing, they became servants of that Word. So that's what Luke is saying. And he says he wants to write an orderly account. This is the well-educated Gentile saying, yeah, I'm doing a little better than the people who went before me. And you see how he uses Mark and how he improves the Greek of Mark and cuts out repetitions in Mark. So he wants to write an orderly account. And he addresses this to Theophilus. Now, who is Theophilus? Some people say it was a real flesh and blood person, probably Luke's patron. Somebody had to pay for the parchment Luke used and the ink that he had to buy to write. So some say he was Luke's patron. Others say no. Theophilus is a literary figure, a symbol, because the word Theophilus means friend of God. So when Luke is saying Theophilus, he is speaking about every Christian. We are all, if you like, Theophilus. And he writes so that you may know the truth. And the word he used there is asphaleia. And it's not just truth, intellectual truth, but it's conviction, the assurance of faith, that you might have that as the firm foundation of your life. So he's retelling the story of Jesus. And he wants to retell it in a way that's meaningful for the people of his time. Because Mark, he says Mark is not just enough. Mark was written in Rome. It was written for a different situation. I want to retell the story of Jesus so that people more easily will see the meaning of it for their lives. The communities for which Luke wrote were predominantly Gentile and non-Jewish communities. And these are communities living in the 80s, and they're communities in transition, and are going through a number of related crises. A crisis of identity, a crisis of missionary motivation, and a crisis of faith. These are Gentiles who had cut themselves off from their Gentile past and their Gentile traditions and their Gentile way of life. There are also people who never really felt 100% home in Judaism. didn't have any roots in Judaism. And some people were saying to them that Christianity is just an illegitimate offshoot of Judaism. These were people who are living some 50 years, 60 years after the time of Christ. So they feel a little bit distant in time and space from the life of Jesus and the life of the early church. So they're asking questions like, who are we? Where are we rooted? Where are we connected? Where are we anchored? Do we belong? Are we just drifting aimlessly on some sea or other? So they have a crisis of identity. Now, as you know, if you have a crisis of identity and you're not kind of happy in your own skin, you find it hard to reach out to other people. It's the same way with a community that's having a crisis of identity, asking questions about, basic questions about belonging, connectedness. It's harder to reach out to other people. And this was a community which these communities were probably founded by Paul, or greatly influenced by the missionary work of Paul, and were missionary communities themselves. But now mission is becoming hard, not terribly successful. So a kind of reaching out is a little more difficult. So they have a crisis of missionary motivation, and they have a crisis of faith. Life isn't easy for them. Probably they were being discriminated against. Probably they were going through some persecution. And they're asking, like, where is God? Why isn't God around to help us? Will God be there for us as we face an uncertain future? So that was the type of thing that was being asked in the communities for which Luke wrote. And you could ask, like, what are the crises today? Are they very different from these crises? Just take the whole question of sexual abuse, and what problems, what great questions that has given rise to. For some people, they're faced with a question of identity, in the sense of, do I really want to belong to that church? Do I feel connected? People feel alienated from the church because of what's happened. A crisis of missionary motivation, which is basically a crisis of not being able to reach out. And isn't that happening in the church? Like, people are saying, good God, there's low morale, there's not a lot of energy or motivation. People are saying, like, you've no credibility anymore. So it's harder to reach out when you're like that. And maybe we're asking questions of faith. Where was God? Why did God allow such things to happen? Can we trust God to safeguard all of us? And people are asking questions about, basic questions of trusting the leaders of the church. So the questions we have today are not too unlike the questions that were there in Luke's time. Just a few things about Luke as a storyteller. You have some great stories in Luke's Gospel. Some of the best stories that we remember, most memorable: Prodigal Son, Good Samaritan, Dives and Lazarus, Zacchaeus, etc., all found in Luke's Gospel. And Luke not only wrote short stories, but he wrote one big, long story that has a great sense of unity. He connects the story of Jesus in the Gospel with the story of the early church in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, I won't go into it in any great detail, but it's certain that Luke actually wrote the Acts of the Apostles as well. It's addressed to Theophilus also. At the beginning of the Acts, he talks about the former book he wrote, that is the Gospel. Luke so links the story of Jesus to the story of the church, and also puts his story in the form of a journey. The journey, and what it's the journey of the Word of God in the ministry of Jesus first continued in the ministry of the church. And he presents Jesus very much as somebody on a journey. And he thinks about Christianity, you see in the Acts of the Apostles, he thinks about Christianity as being on a journey. In one place in the Acts of the Apostles, he calls the Christian movement the way. Now, do we think about our discipleship, our mission, our morality in terms of being on a journey, rather than having reached, the end of the journey? All of us are on a journey. All of us are, have a way to go, so to speak. The main theme of Luke's Gospel is theme, overarching theme for Luke's Gospel. It's the story of the hospitality of God. It's the story of a hospitable God, a God who reaches out to invite all of us into to sit at his table, to invite all of us into his life. A God who wants to include people. Mauricio's getting there.
Yeah. That's somehow there is a problem here. Yeah, that's a version of it.
Okay, that's the one, the Rublev icon. The Trinity sitting at the table. We're being invited into. There's a place for us at the table. God is a welcoming, hospitable God. The official title of that icon is the Hospitality of Abraham, because Luke took the story of the three angels coming to Abraham to tell him that he and his wife are going to have a son, and then he uses Rublev. Rublev used that then to say something about the nature of God. So really it is the joyful good news of a hospitable God who reaches out to all to give them an experience of salvation, and that is good news of joy, and that's what Luke wants to share with us. Now, any questions at this stage?
I was going to ask, do people know roughly how long after the Gospel was written did Luke write the Acts of the Apostles? What was there?
He wrote them together, probably.
Together.
Yeah,
Okay.
he probably wrote them together.
Okay.
And I never saw anybody saying, like, he took a rest for 10 years and then wrote the second volume.
Okay.
No, he wrote one work in 2 parts.
Okay.
Can I just ask? I mean, I've read before that when Luke went back to Jerusalem, when Paul went back to Jerusalem, that Luke went with him, and that was where he interviewed Mark, he interviewed Peter in Rome, but he was also supposed to have interviewed the Blessed Virgin in the Holy Lands, and that's how he got the story of the Nativity.
I don't know. There's very little in the Gospels to suggest that's what happened. Like, when you look at the evidence, you saw his main source was the Gospel of Mark. And he had his own experiences, he had met his own people, he heard his own stories, and some of the stories that we have in Luke's Gospel are found only in Luke's Gospel. So he has his own special material. Where he got it from, maybe he got it from some people, that it was preserved in a family tradition or in a community or something like that. Yeah.
Because just striking, some of the things that you were saying about him, about how his education, how he sort of formed this narrative and took things from Mark that were repetitive and worked them out. It's always kind of struck me, and just the prologue that you were reading there. He decided to write his own account for Theophilus, and he spoke. He says there that he spoke to people who were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word.
Yeah, yeah.
So it sounded. I always took that he went and he interviewed people, something in the lines of a bit like a modern day reporter. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
what did you see and what happened and what was your experience and that kind of thing.
Well, there's about year 300, a writer, a church historian called Eusebius, suggested that Luke went around and interviewed people, and he wrote his gospel, and that St. Paul used Luke's gospel. When St. Paul refers to my gospel, he's referring to the gospel of Luke. But I mean, St. Paul was long since dead before Luke wrote his gospel. So sometimes these traditions have very little historical basis,
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? You get the general drift of what reading a gospel means. Not just here to get a kind of information. It's about trying to get meaning for today. That's probably the main point I wanted to make. He wrote his gospel, and that St. Paul used Luke's gospel. When St. Paul refers to my gospel, he's referring to the gospel of Luke. But I mean, St. Paul was long since dead before Luke wrote his gospel. So sometimes these traditions have very little historical basis,
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? You get the general drift of what reading a gospel means. Not just here to get a kind of information. It's about trying to get meaning for today. That's probably the main point I wanted to make. Now, one of the things we'll do, say for about probably about 10 minutes. When do we finish, Marcel?
45, yeah. So we have about 20 minutes.
Yeah, okay. If we, for 10 minutes, I'll give you a story from Luke's Gospel. Just a story that really is a good example of what I mean by the transforming power of a story, of how a story can transform people. And it's a story that we all know, and it's the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, it's a 25 copies. So
There's a couple more here, Mauricio. Yeah. You all right?
Yeah.
Sound okay? Yeah, great. Now this story, any good reader among you would like just to read it. Listen.
Oh, I'll have a go.
Okay, have a go there already. Yeah.
Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while travelling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise."
Yeah. So it's thanks, Eddie. It's a story about a meeting of Jesus between Jesus and a scribe. So that's the first thing. We're talking about meeting Jesus. It's also a story that shows us, how a meeting with Jesus can transform people. And it's also a story which zeroes in on the main theme of Luke's Gospel, which is the hospitality of a compassionate God. That's the reason I chose it. So, there's some questions here. How does Luke portray the scribe who questions Jesus? Like when you read that, how does he come across to you? How does Luke portray Jesus in this episode? How did Jesus deal with the scribe? How does Jesus respond to the scribe? How are the characters in the parable portrayed? The priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. And what might this episode be saying to us about our Christian discipleship and mission today? So if you could, for about 10 minutes, get in little huddles of about 3 or 4, and just give your initial impressions of the story and what you would say by way of answer to these questions. And then we